Predating America's conception, women have played instrumental roles in society which have changed throughout time in a number of different ways due to their intersectionality with race and class issues. Since time immemorial, Native American women often held the same status as men. Some Native societies, such as the Lakota, even structured power in a matriarchy, giving some women power over men. As the colonizers reached America, many Native women were married to the colonists as a means of establishing trade relations. In colonial society, however, women were confined to more traditional patriarchal gender roles. They were seen as a homemaker whose duty was to bear and care for children and be a good wife. However, there were some women who expressed their disdain for this role, such as Abigail Adams in a letter to her husband, John Adams. She asked that the Continental Congress remember the ladies and advocated for more representation for women in the new government. Despite this, American women utilized what power they had in support of the American Revolution. American women helped to organize a successful boycott of British goods, and they began to make clothes for soldiers in the homespun movement to encourage this boycott. They sold provisions to troops, quartered soldiers, and attended to their soldier husbands. They raised funds for the troops to support the war effort, and some women, like Molly Pitcher, became directly involved in the war. Molly Pitcher served as a water carrier up until she took the role of her deceased husband, swapping and loading cannons. In contrast, enslaved women were living a completely different life. They were forced to do the same manual labor as enslaved men did, but they also endured brutal assault and rape by their masters, oftentimes ending up pregnant with babies who would not be claimed by the father. They also cared for the children of white families that they served on top of their own children, who oftentimes were also enslaved. In the early 1800s, America began to industrialize, and the Second Great Awakening grew in popularity. With these changes in society, women's roles began to shift in numerous ways, such as becoming more involved with the church and the resulting moral reform movements. The value of true womanhood, which depicted women as beings who should uphold piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity, began to grow in popularity, and this role was heavily forced on women. This, combined with men's absence after taking jobs in factories during the Industrial Revolution, led women to take on the job of instilling American values on their children, a concept referred to as Republican motherhood. Women also began to increasingly take on roles outside of the home. Lower-class women were not afforded the ability to participate in the cult of domesticity, and the large number of factory jobs available allowed many of these women to work for a wage and earn financial independence. Many women relocated to urban centers where they found work at factories such as the Lowell Mill Factory. The ideas from both the Second Great Awakening and the cult of domesticity had cemented women as a source of morality, which meant that women were able to take on leading roles in moral reform movements. These movements included the temperance movement, the abolitionist movement, and the creation of settlement houses, like the Hull House. Harriet Beecher Stowe was an influential abolitionist who wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which helped publicize the harsh realities of slavery. Women's participation in reform movements made them more influential within the public sphere and set the foundation for the suffrage movement. In 1848, 5 influential suffragists, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, organized the first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls. At this convention, they created the Declaration of Sentiments, which used the Declaration of Independence to make a statement about the exclusion of women from the political sphere. Later in 1865, Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, another prominent suffragist, created the Petition for Universal Suffrage, which earned over 400,000 signatures and became the most signed physical petition in history. Women also served vital roles during the Civil War. They were more directly involved than they were in the Revolutionary War, serving as nurses, managing supplies, and feeding and quartering soldiers. Some women even fought in the war and served as spies. The Second Industrial Revolution expanded on the roles of women in industry that emerged from the market revolution. Many more lower-class women were employed in factories and became increasingly involved in unions. Women also led to the creation of new labor laws, such as the one debated in Muller v. Oregon, which limited women to a 10-hour workday. As a result of the death of multiple women in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, laws were created requiring better building infrastructure to make working conditions safer for everyone. Women continued to have larger roles in the public sphere, which was supported by the progressive movement. The progressive movement was a catalyst of Seneca Falls, the Second Industrial Revolution, and women's roles in reform movements. Women called for factory reforms, suffrage, temperance, and birth control methods, as well as helping to open up new job and education opportunities. Women increasingly took roles as secretaries, store clerks, seamstresses, and there was increasing availability for co-education, paving the way for women to exercise their political rights, voting in state and local elections. The progressive movement helped to make a lot of headway in the suffrage movement. Alice Paul was an extremely outspoken and influential suffragist who organized a huge protest outside of the White House, taking the effort from a state-by-state approach to the national level. She also proposed the Equal Rights Amendment, which explicitly prohibited sex-based discrimination. This amendment almost became ratified in 1972, but pushback against it continued to be widespread, meaning it didn't pass in a number of states. Finally, in 1919, the 19th Amendment became ratified, and in 1920, it was added to the Constitution. By allowing women the right to vote, this ended the struggle and push for women's voting rights, yet there was still much inequality between the sexes. In the 20th century, as America entered both world wars, women began managing the home front. They took over many of the roles left behind by men who got drafted, such as industrial production. This provided the resources that America needed to continue to be a global superpower in the wars. They focused on conserving resources needed for the war effort, planting victory gardens, and again, some women served in the war. In the 1930s, when FDR became president and began to implement New Deal policies, he didn't do it alone. He had two very influential women working alongside him, his wife, Eleanor, and his Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins. Frances Perkins pushed for much of the labor-related New Deal legislation, stating that she wouldn't take on the role as Secretary of Labor if these policies were not implemented. Eleanor Roosevelt completely revolutionized the role of First Lady. She was heavily engaged in public affairs and outspoken about the things she believed in. Sometimes this differed from her husband. She also had a leading role in designing and gaining support for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Even after FDR's death in 1945, she continued to be influential in politics, becoming the United States' first UN delegate for the Human Rights Committee and advocated for civil rights for African and Asian Americans. Women have also always been involved in the push for racial equality. An early example of this is Ida B. Wells, a journalist who published a number of articles which directly described the hardships and lynchings imposed on African Americans. Decades later, the civil rights movement was in full swing. People usually remember Rosa Parks, a woman who refused to give up her seat on the bus, but it's also important to put the spotlight on other women like Ella Baker. Baker is often called the mother of the civil rights movement, and she was very involved in the NAACP and organizing protests during this era. In the 60s, alongside the civil rights movement, the feminism movement exploded, shifting the focus from white, middle-class, cisgender women to include women of color and women in developing nations. Protests were widespread and focused primarily on gaining legal, economic, and social equality for women. This era of second-wave feminism ended in the 1980s with the feminist sex wars and was quickly replaced with third-wave feminism in the 90s. During the era of second-wave feminism, a landmark court case that would have a profound impact on women's rights was decided. Roe v. Wade involved a woman named Jane Roe who sued a doctor in the state of Texas because she was legally not allowed to have an abortion. She argued that the laws were vague and that they violated her right to privacy. She won her case in a 7-2 decision, meaning that abortion was nationally legalized. Unfortunately, in 2022, Roe v. Wade was overturned, and now abortion legality is an issue that is up to state governments rather than the federal government. As a result of the renewed liberalism of the 60s and 70s, a second wave of feminism known as the women's liberation movement emerged. The movement advocated for equality in pay, job and educational opportunities, and backed the Equal Rights Amendment. Again, the ERA was never ratified to the Constitution due to the efforts of conservative women such as Phyllis Schlafly, who protested the amendment and the women's liberation movement. Since then, women not just in America but all over the world have continued to fight for equality. Currently, many people are focused on closing the gender pay gap, campaigning for abortion to remain legalized, and ending sexual violence. There's also much debate surrounding gender roles, and many feminists advocate for a woman's right to have equal opportunities in regards to choosing a job or choosing to be a stay-at-home mom. There is still so much work to be done to achieve the equality that American women have been fighting for hundreds of years, but it's so important to recognize all the progress that has been made.